But the efforts of BAE Systems, which spent $3.7 million on lobbying in 2022, were successful because Section 1029 of the NDAA prohibits the military from retiring more than 4 of the littoral combat ships. So the military wanted to trash 8 of them. And so the lawmakers seem to have split the difference and forced them to keep 4. 4 ships that we know are lemons. 4 ships that we know can't take a hit from a well-made missile. 4 ships we know put our sailors in greater danger than they need to be. Also, some corporations can make money that they were promised to do unnecessary work.
I am so damn tired of being lied to. I don't think I can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies, but I'm not gonna buy it anymore.
Hello, my friend, and thank you for listening to the 269th episode of Congressional Dish. I'm your host, Jennifer Briney, and I am finally done with this episode. This episode, which I've been working on this entire year, which is about the National Defense Authorization Act for 2023. Now, the NDAA, if you're not aware, is the war authorization that is passed every year, in which I like to look into to find out if the parties in charge have any new wars simmering that us peasants aren't aware of yet. Now, when I read these, I look for the versions that don't have enormous margins, which are like quadruple spaced. I like to use the versions that are dense and single spaced, kind of like book text. And this year's NDAA, the book-like version that I use, is 1,772 pages long. But that's just the authorization, the permission for our war activities. I also had to go into the 2023 funding law, which funded our entire government in one giant bill instead of 12 separate bills, which is what Congress is supposed to do. And that monster funding law is 1,653 pages long. But even that doesn't quite capture all of it because the funding charts and the explanations for funding can be found in separate documents called explanatory statements, of which there are 12, and each of those can be hundreds of pages long as well. Basically, what I'm saying is that this took so long because looking into this stuff is a real bitch. And with that volume of text, there's no way for one person to read it all. And full disclosure, I did not read it all. But after a decade of doing this, I know the structure of these annual laws pretty well. And so I don't need to read the whole thing anymore to find the important stuff. And so today, you're going to get a big picture summary of the NDAA, followed by some information about our new partner in war activities, Ecuador, which even though that's a small country and a minor partnership, what's happening there is illustrative of our big picture in war as well. But before we get into the details of this year's war authorization, I do want to just kind of summarize what I've discovered in terms of the real big picture, like what appears to be the goal of our country's overall militarism. And it really boils down to our country creating, promoting, and defending an economic system that's intended to be the one and only economic system on Earth. The economic system that our country stands for doesn't really have a name, but there are specific organizations at the center of it. The main judicial branch of their global economic system is the World Trade Organization. The money is controlled by the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund is essentially its loan shark. The International Monetary Fund, or IMF, gives governments cash in return for changes to their economic laws that integrate those countries into the system. And the changes that the IMF demands are ones that make that country much more corporate friendly. In general, there seem to be 3 economic principles that can be found consistently in IMF reform demands. First, governments are told to remove rules and regulations standing in the way of the accumulations of profits by private businesses. Second, governments should sell off any assets that they own that corporations could be running at a profit. And then finally, governments should dramatically cut back on the funding of social programs for their citizens. Because the fewer services that citizens get in return for their taxes, the more that those people have to pay private businesses out of pocket, which is considered a good thing. Basically, what I see happening in the world is that the corporate representatives in the Republican and Democratic parties, which have fully captured our government, are using our government to export corporatism around the world. And they brand their economic system freedom and democracy. That's what they say we stand for. But our military and our secret spook structures, have overthrown leaders of other countries time and time again who have been democratically elected. And so despite the branding, it's not democracy. It's not an electoral system that we stand for. The best indicator of whether a head of a country is going to be supported by the United States and be armed by our military is whether or not that country is letting the corporations in and changing their laws as the IMF demands and minimizing the amount of money that the multinational companies have to contribute to those local communities. If a foreign government is doing that, they are good. If they are not, and especially if they're trying to create a different economic system, they are bad. And once I became aware of this pattern, I couldn't unsee it. It's consistent. It's everywhere. And while the details are always different going country by country and, every situation, obviously they're all different. But at the center of our relationship with each country that I've researched is whether or not that country is loyal to, well, what exactly? Because like I said, the system doesn't really have a name. Broadly, some refer to it as the market economy. Some call it capitalism. Some refer to it as neoliberalism or neoconservatism. But I don't like any of those terms. They're too broad. They're too confusing. They're too theoretical. They're just too ism. But there are real, identifiable organizations operating this economic system. Organizations that, by the way, could be changed. And they are the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. And so because these three pillars of the system don't really have a name that groups them together, I refer to their system as a whole as the World Trade System. Now that's a summary, obviously, but I've been exploring this and documenting this pattern on air for years, since the fall of 2015 to be exact. That's when I researched this system really for the first time. It was around episode 100 with the World Trade Organization episode. And I've been watching this pattern play out in real time ever since. Ukraine, Syria, Nicaragua, Belarus, Venezuela, Puerto Rico. I've done episodes about what's been happening in quite a few places. And I just keep seeing the World Trade System as central to most of our global crisis points. My lovely assistant, Claire, is going to put a bunch of episodes in the show notes for you if you want to jump down the World Trade System rabbit hole and really understand what the hell I'm talking about. You can also go to the now operational Most Valuable Episodes page on congressionaldish.com, which is where we have our episodes listed by the number of executive producers. Because this podcast is 100% listener supported, it always has been and it always will be. And executive producers are people who have contributed, either all at once or over time, a cumulative $535 to this podcast. And every time you do that, you get to put your name right alongside mine as an executive producer on the episode you're most proud to have produced. Because it's no bullshit that you will have contributed a significant percentage of that episode's production costs. But you are also publicly vouching for that episode and telling all new listeners that this episode is one that you consider especially valuable, and it moves that episode up the list. And so if you're new to Congressional Dish, first of all, welcome and thank you for listening. But for you, the Most Valuable Episodes page is a great starting place for you to figure out what episodes to listen to next. Because a lot of the episodes that examine the World Trade System are executive producer favorites. And so to see that list, go to congressionaldish.com and check out the Most Valuable Episodes page. And if you find this podcast valuable in general, please also visit the support page and contribute whatever amount you think is fair and matches the value that you receive from this podcast existing. You don't have to be an executive producer to support the show in an amount that matters and will feel good for both of us. All amounts help. All amounts are appreciated. And all amounts will grant you the freedom to listen to and love these episodes guilt-free. But as you listen to this episode today, please ask yourself if you've heard this information anywhere else, if anyone else has done this work for you, and also ask yourself if you're willing to do this research yourself. Because if you find yourself valuing the information and want to continue to get this information without sifting through laws that consist of thousands of pages, please pay for the show in whatever amount you consider fair. Because the only number on my end that feels unfair is 0. But anyway, back to the World Trade System. I have been yammering about the World Trade System for years. So most of this audience isn't new to the concept and has heard me summarize it quite possibly literally 100 times. And so if you want more info on that, pause, jump into the archive, and meet me back here when you're ready. Because there's nothing in this year's NDAA that has me freaking out. And so you can pause and come back to this episode. You've got time. But this NDAA really reinforces some themes that we've been examining here for a long time. Because big picture, what's happening right now is that China and Russia are our main adversaries because they don't follow the rules of the World Trade System. Russia just straight up refuses to adopt and follow the rules and has physically fought back against the attempts to expand the World Trade System into specifically Syria and Ukraine in the last decade. And so why Russia bad at this point is pretty obvious. But China, they're a different brand of bad. China signed all of the World Trade System paperwork and officially joined it a few months after 9/11. But since then, China has just never followed the rules. This was annoying but tolerated for a few decades. What's changed is that China is now actively creating an alternative global scale economic system while still officially remaining a member of the World Trade Organization. And China is actually using the World Trade System playbook to do it. So we talked a little bit before about the IMF, the loan shark, right? Since the end of World War II, the IMF has been going around the world and loaning out cash, sometimes desperately needed cash, to governments but with strings attached, strings requiring corporate-friendly changes to the country's economic laws. Well, China took the IMF playbook and is straight ripping it off. China is now going around the world and loaning countries money, but in return, they want China itself or Chinese companies, because Chinese companies are often partnered with the Chinese government. But in return for Chinese loans, China is getting long-term contracts on infrastructure projects. They're working out infrastructure ownership and operations deals. And China is getting itself access to natural resources in foreign lands. It's the same game, but the beneficiaries are different. In the IMF loan game, the beneficiaries are the shareholders of the companies that get to go into the opened countries and profit, returning little to the local communities. It's a wealth extraction game for the shareholder class. In the China loan game, the beneficiaries are the Chinese government and business leaders, which also get to profit from the resources of foreign lands. But because the Chinese government is getting the contracts and the resources, it could be argued that the Chinese people are the beneficiaries since the wealth extraction goes to their government. Depending on how the government leaders choose to spend it, that money could be used to benefit every Chinese citizen in the form of government services that make their lives easier and more affordable. Now, I don't know if that's what's happening. I don't know shit about life inside China. But I do think about this difference a lot. Because the Chinese definitely have global leadership ambitions. That's undeniable based on their behavior. And if you want to get more details about that, listen to Combating China and Minerals Are the New Oil. I'll put both of those episodes in the show notes for you if you want to learn about that. But it's their government, the tool that organizes all of the Chinese people, that is the recipient of the benefits of their global ambitions. The World Trade System, though, which we pay to create, which we pay to promote, and we pay to militarily defend around the entire world, it's an expensive project funded from our paychecks. But it's really the shareholders of the multinationals who benefit from what the World Trade System does the most. Almost half of Americans own no stock at all, which means that almost half of us get no benefit at all from wealth that is funneled from foreign lands to corporate shareholders. We pay, the shareholders collect. And while I'm pretty sure that funneling wealth out of foreign lands with shady contracts is not the morally correct thing to do, if we're going to do it, and clearly we are, it does seem odd that we would be okay with paying as much as we do to create, promote, and militarily defend a system that doesn't benefit us all. And so I can see why the Chinese people would support their military and economic adventures around the world, since at least in theory, and probably propaganda, the returns would go to the Chinese tax money pool. But I struggle to see why Americans who make their money in paychecks, and who have money taken out of those paychecks to fund our military and economic adventures, I struggle to see why paycheck earners who don't own stock would support paying for actions that serve only to funnel money to the richest half of Americans. I think that if that half of Americans, the paycheck earners, had any idea what was going on, they would not be okay with that arrangement, which might explain why no one explains our role in the world this way. Why I certainly didn't understand it until years into this career. They don't want us to understand because the costs to American taxpayers in the amount of money we pay in taxes and the services we don't get in return for our tax money so that we can afford this level of militarism. Let's just take a look at how much money we're talking about here, coming out of our paychecks to support this effort. This year, the Department of Defense is getting $806 billion for its war activities. And by the way, that number does not include military construction or all our veterans' expenses. Also, that $806 billion going to the War Department is almost $44 billion more than requested by the Department of Defense. $44 billion just 'cause. And to put that in perspective, as many of you know, I like to measure government expenditures in big digs because I am the child of two Bostonians. Boston is my favorite city in the world. And Boston's Big Dig project transformed that city that I love. One of the things that it did is it removed a hideous highway that was running through downtown and replaced it with a park. That freeway now goes underneath the city. You wouldn't even know that it's there. That project also put freeway tunnels underneath the water so that the airport would be connected with parts of the city that it had never been connected with before. And that project built the iconic Zakim Bridge. That project, the Big Dig, transformed that city 100% for the better. But the project was corrupt and costs ended up ballooning to about $25 billion. It's the most expensive highway project in the United States. And Congress gave the military, for just 1 year, almost 2 big digs more than it asked for a total of about 32 big digs. Can you imagine how incredible this country could be if we were funding 32 big dig scale projects here per year? That's transformative money. And that's what we're giving to the military every year. That's how expensive it is to be the global enforcers of the World Trade System. And as for what they do with it, well, for a huge chunk of it, we're just not allowed to know. And so I wanted to know just how much of that $806 billion would just be a black hole, a classified black hole. And they don't make it easy to find out. It's not like there's a line in the funding chart that says secret spook or regime changes or even classified total. And so I went through 329 pages of funding charts line by line because, fun fact, the PDF provided to the public is a Xeroxed version of a PDF, which means that I couldn't even search for the word classify. Those sneaky pricks. But I would not be deterred. I wanted to get this number for you. And so I added up every classified line, searching every page. And the total in classified funding for the War Department, you ready? $37,398,511,000, which, by the way, is $2.5 billion more in secret money than the Defense Department even asked for. And an interesting fact about that money, a huge chunk of that, about 65% of it, is for Air Force procurement. Put another way, 65% of the secret money in the War Department is going towards buying stuff for the Air Force. And that's all I know. I can't give you any more details. But that fact has stuck in my head these last few weeks as Grandpa Joe has been shooting balloons and UFOs out of the sky. Could all that secret money for Air Force toys be a part of that story? Who knows? We're not allowed to know what the Air Force is paying for with all that secret cash. But we can get a real good idea of where the rest of our money is going using other provisions of the NDAA. This year's NDAA, of course, reauthorizes and extends funding for the wars we're already in. So it extends our funding of Iraq's military, and it extends our funding of whoever the is willing to fight whoever the are members of ISIL or ISIS, and whoever the is willing to fight and try to overthrow Bashir al-Assad's government in Syria. Also, when it comes to Syria, this NDA requires a strategy to be put together to fight the Assad government as part of the drug war. And so don't be surprised to hear about Bashir al-Assad, the drug dealer, starting sometime this year. This NDAA, like all the others I've read, also prohibits, once again, money being used to close Guantanamo Bay Prison or to release the people who have been convicted of no crimes who are still being held there after 20 years with no trials, who were apparently just going to let rot there until they die. And speaking of death, I also noticed something ghoulishly self-serving in this year's NDAA. As of the signing of this law, Department of Defense money is now allowed to be used for, quote, support as the Secretary considers appropriate, unquote, for funerals or memorial events for former members of Congress, which specifically includes transportation to and from the funeral or memorial. Support. That term is as broad as it gets. What kinds of support are allowed? Like, can the support pay for the venue, the catering, the booze, fancy hotels for guests? And who gets the transportation? The family of the dead member or former member of Congress? Current members of Congress who want to go to the funeral? Everyone who wants to go to the funeral? That's left entirely up to the Defense Secretary, who, of course, has no reason whatsoever to want to kiss the asses of members of Congress. It's only the finances of the entire Department of Defense, including the Defense Secretary's salary and authorizations for war, that are determined by that particular group of people. The Defense Secretary has no reason to authorize lavish funeral expenses to please members of Congress. So why bother setting limits in law? There was only one thing here that was prevented in law, and that was partisanship getting in the way of free funeral expenses. Because the support can be requested by the Speaker of the House, the Minority Leader of the House, the Senate Majority Leader, or the Senate Minority Leader, ensuring that no matter what party is in power, both parties will have the ability to honor their pals, pulling from the Defense Department's massive and unaccountable bucket of money. And I do think that the Defense Department, if you couldn't tell from my sarcasm, is incentivized to authorize lavish funeral expenses on members of Congress. Because Congress sure does shower the Defense Department with money, so much more than they asked for. And so I looked at what Congress was overfunding, and I noticed some serious overfunding in research and development, as in tax money we spend on creating new war inventions that private companies will then take from us like gifts and profit from as they arm the rest of the world. And so to see what Congress wanted more of than the military requested in terms of research, I again went line by line and highlighted some of the largest and most disturbing overfunds. And I did put my highlighted PDF in the show notes for you if you want to check out these charts for yourself. But I discovered $1.7 billion that no one asked for research into upgraded war machines that I recognized as tools designed to kill. In fact, $300 million of that unrequested research money was labeled lethality technology. So Congress massively overfunded research into causing death. Which bothered me because this means that the Defense Department could have gotten every penny that it wanted, and we could have funded $1.7 billion of anything else. And selfishly, as someone who's had skin cancer 4 times in the last 2 years, I keep thinking that $1.7 billion into cancer research, $1.7 billion to research how to heal people instead of how to kill, that's transformative money. And I'd be much prouder of my money spent that way. And I'd much more directly benefit from it. But no, Congress spent $1.7 billion that no one asked for on research into killing machines. And by the way, bringing back a nightmare from the past that is now apparently on its way to becoming a reality, that unrequested research funding includes not a lot of money, I will admit, but it includes $9 million to develop, quote, autonomous offense swarming, unquote, which I'm pretty sure is military speak for drone swarms. Now, it's been 5 years since drone swarms appeared on our radar, so let me refresh your memory. The sound clips you're about to hear are of George Shultz testifying to Congress in January of 2018. And George Shultz, if you're not aware, is a big deal as one of the chief designers of the World Trade System. Before he died, he had a very long resume. But here are the highlights that stand out to me. George Shultz was a professor at the University of Chicago Graduate School of Business in the 1950s and 1960s, which is essentially the ideological hub of this entire economic system that we're trying to globalize. George Shultz left that gig to become President Richard Nixon's Labor Secretary and Treasury Secretary. George Shultz eventually resigned from being the Treasury Secretary to become the Executive Vice President and eventually the President of Bechtel Corporation. And that particular multinational corporation is one that the World Trade System has been especially lucrative for. because Bechtel specializes in mega infrastructure projects and has been one of the main companies and families, because Bechtel is a private company, that has benefited and become obscenely wealthy from the game of privatizing public infrastructure around the world, and then using the power of the governments that they've bought to write laws that allow their company to be free from paying much in local taxes, which then allows them to extract lots of profit from the citizens of that country and pass it along to, in this case, themselves. So George Shultz was the president of that. And then he left that mother of all corporate gigs to become President Reagan's Secretary of State for over 6 years. And then after leaving government, he became a titan of the corporate world once again. He went back to the Bechtel board of directors. He was the chairman of JP Morgan Chase's International Advisory Council. He was on the board of directors at pharmaceutical multinational Gilead Sciences. And he was on the board of directors at Accreditive Health, which helps healthcare industry profit suckers gain the billing freedom that this economic system has granted them in order to get as much money out of you as possible when you get sick, to then pass that money from your pocket to their shareholders. George Shultz was an absolute titan of government and industry. He helped design the World Trade System. He dedicated his life to it. And when he talked, Congress listened. And here is the idea that he shared with Congress halfway through the Trump years that gave me actual nightmares.
Small platforms will carry a very destructive power. Then you can put these small platforms on drones, and drones can be manufactured easily, and you can have a great many of them inexpensively. So then you can have a swarm armed with lethal equipment. Any fixed target is a real target. So an airfield where our Air Force stores planes is a very vulnerable target. A ship at anchor is a vulnerable target. So you've got to think about that in terms of how you deploy. And in terms of the drones, while such a system cannot be jammed, it would only serve to get a drone, talking about getting a drone to the area where its target is, but not sure it could hit a specific target. At that point, the optical systems guided by artificial intelligence could use onboard multispectral imaging to find a target and guide the weapons. Exactly that autonomy that makes the technological convergence a threat today, because such drones will require no external input other than the signature of the designed target. They will be not vulnerable to jamming. Not requiring human intervention, the autonomous platforms will also be able to operate in very large numbers.
And in the beginning of 2018, here's specifically what he was suggesting these drone swarms could be for.
I think there's a great lesson here for what we do in NATO to contain Russia, because you can deploy these things in boxes so you don't even know what they are, and on trucks, and train people to unload quickly and fire. So it's a huge deterrent capability that is available, and it's inexpensive enough so that we can expect our allies to pitch in and get them for themselves.
This is the technology that the NDAA puts research money towards. Robot birds with bombs. It'll be real unlucky to get shit on by one of these things. My God, what a future these people are designing for us, huh? And while we're speaking of drones, Congress also provided $350 million for drones that no one asked for. They provided $466 million for Humvees that no one asked for. They provided over $500 million for helicopters that no one asked for. They provided $822 million for tanks no one asked for. They provided $2.1 billion for fighter jets that no one asked for. And they provided $3.2 billion for a few more battleships because, I don't know, Tom Cruise needs to film Top Gun 3. But there is actually a reason for all this overfunding, all jokes aside. If you're thinking in terms of the World Trade System and how our government has been captured by those who serve it, it actually makes perfect sense. And so let's take a minute and look at one example from this year's NDAA. Now, in this case, the NDAA is preventing the military from trashing some ships that it doesn't want anymore because they suck, essentially overfunding their unnecessary maintenance. And so here's the backstory on that, summarizing from a fascinating article written in the New York Times by Eric Lipton, which, of course, I put in the show notes for you. But Freedom-class ships were first invented after September 11th to fight so-called non-traditional threats, as in random groups of humans who aren't fighting as part of a military effort. But these ships have been problematic in every way. Financially, these terrorist hunting ships ended up costing more than twice what had been expected, about $500 million per ship, compared with an early estimate of $220 million. And once they were operational, we found out that they operated about as safely as a surgeon loaded on LSD. Take, for example, the USS Little Rock on its first military mission to Central and South America to help somehow with the drug war. It doesn't really matter what they were going there to do because they never made it there to do it. First, the ship's generators got glitchy and the ship briefly lost power. The Freedom-class ships, designed to hunt terrorists and drug dealers, apparently, were designed to be operated by a relatively small crew, but that meant that the ship wasn't carrying enough sailors with the knowledge needed to fix the complicated generator problems. And so the commander decided to head to the Navy base in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, where the ship sat for about a month waiting for repairs. But during that time, it was also discovered that the ship had an even more complicated problem with its radar system, which meant that it couldn't accurately aim its guns or see incoming air threats. And so a team of contractors were flown out from Germany to do the radar system repairs. But the repairs were so intense they couldn't be completed in Cuba, and so the ship was sent back to America. But on that voyage, bearings in the gears crumbled to tiny bits, and the ship barely made it home. And the gear thing, it turned out, was its fatal flaw. Because it wasn't just the USS Little Rock with this problem. Gears would get ground to dust in all of the ships because this was caused by a design flaw. We didn't have just one lemon, the whole bucket was sour. And there were other systemic problems too. The engines on these ships are so loud that they drown out the sounds of enemy submarines. The ships are also gas hogs, which limits how far they can go. And they have less protective armor than typical warships because they were designed as terrorist hunters, as random civilian hunters. And so they can't compete with ships designed by militaries to fight militaries. And so since these ships just can't do what the military needs now that we seem destined to go to war with Russia and China, last year the Pentagon announced that 8 of the 10 littoral combat ships would be retired, even though they averaged only 4 years old and had been built to last 25 years. Here's Admiral Michael Gilday. He's the Chief of Naval Operations, testifying to the Senate Appropriations Committee, Subcommittee on Defense, on May 25th of last year.
We need a capable, lethal, ready Navy more than we need a larger Navy that's less capable, less lethal, and less ready. And so, unfortunately, the littoral combat ships that we have, while the mechanical issues were a factor, a bigger factor was the lack of sufficient warfighting capability against a peer competitor in China.
Now, for me, I know that I helped pay for those ships and that my tax money, which I worked hard for, was wasted. And that is annoying. But is that more important than the safety of our sailors? Because ships that can't survive a Chinese missile are dangerous for our sailors, even off the coasts of Central and South America, which is where the USS Little Rock was headed. Here's General Laura Richardson. She is the commander of the U.S. Southern Command, testifying to the House Armed Services Committee on March 8th of 2022. And in this clip, she's going to use some abbreviations because military leaders abbreviate everything. And so when she says PRC, that means People's Republic of China. And AOR means Area of Responsibility, which in her case is the Central and South American region.
If I look at what PRC is investing in the AOR over a 5-year period of 2017 to 2021, $72 billion. It's off the charts. And I can read a couple of the projects. The most concerning projects that I have are the $6 billion in projects specifically near the Panama Canal. And I look at the strategic lines of communication, Panama Canal and the Strait of Magellan. But just to highlight a couple of the projects, the nuclear power plant in Argentina, $7.9 billion. The highway in Jamaica, $5.6 billion. The energy refinery in Cuba, $5 billion. The highway in Peru, $4 billion. Energy dam in Argentina, $4 billion. The metro in Colombia, $3.9 billion. The freight railway in Argentina, $3 billion. These are not small projects that they're putting in this region. This region is rich in resources, and the Chinese don't go there to invest. They go there to extract. All of these projects are done with Chinese labor, not with host nation countries.
Time has expired.
And so economically, China is all over the Central and South American regions. And on top of that, Here's Evan Ellis, the senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Here he is testifying to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, also in March of last year.
In security engagement, the PRC is a significant provider of military goods to the region, including fighters, transport aircraft and radars for Venezuela, helicopters and armored vehicles for Bolivia, and military trucks for Ecuador.
And so China's all over the region. And when it comes to the likelihood that these ships, if they had our sailors on them in the Central and South American regions, could get into it with Chinese ships, that threat is very real. Because Chinese fishermen are accused, credibly it seems, of fishing off the coasts of Central and South America illegally, as in ways that don't adhere to the rules being written in trade agreements and enforced in the World Trade System. And this is a problem because fishermen who catch fish outside the system leave less fish for the multinationals and locals who do obey the rules of the system. And so essentially, the goal is to prevent the fish from unregulated boats from entering the market and reducing the profits of the U.S.-based corporations that our government serves. To create a policing structure for fishing off of the Central and South American coasts, the South Pacific Regional Fisheries Management Organization Convention was created, which is a partnership with 16 member countries, including us and including China. In 2015, the members of that organization agreed to a boarding and inspection agreement, which allows the United States and all other 15 member countries to board and inspect each other's fishing vessels and record any suspected violations. Now, the private sector is also involved in this policing effort as well. So, for example, last year, an organization whose title translates to For the Fisheries was created to combat illegal fishing. And that organization was funded in part by the U.S. Agency for International Development, which contributed $5.7 million, and the Walton Family Foundation, which contributed over twice that, $12.5 million. The Walton Family Foundation is the Walmart family's foundation. They've been accused multiple times of sourcing their in-house seafood brands from companies that use slave labor. But so have Kroger and Whole Foods and Dollar General and others. And so honestly, I don't know why Walmart is invested to this extent in this effort. But in my research, the Walton family came up multiple times. But last year, in an article by Joshua Goodman of the Associated Press, an article that was funded by the Walton Family Foundation, we found out that last year the Coast Guard used this authority in the South American region for the first time to inspect some Chinese fishing boats. In the Coast Guard's press release, they made it sound like it was all hunky-dory, no problemo. But it turns out that the captains of the Chinese fishing boats resisted the Coast Guard's inspection. 3 of the boats sped away, and one turned aggressively towards the Coast Guard ship, forcing the American ship to skedaddle to avoid being rammed. In the aftermath of that article's release, China called the Coast Guard's inspection attempt a, quote, unauthorized inspection, unquote, and called for the, quote, U.S. side to stop its dangerous and erroneous inspection activities, unquote. And so confrontations with China off the coast of Central and South America are already happening. And while right now they are mild and relatively harmless, the point is that the ships, the littoral combat ships, can't survive a Chinese missile and so are therefore dangerous for our sailors, even off the coast of Central and South America, which again is where the USS Little Rock was headed. And so the military said that these ships have got to go. Here's Admiral Michael Gilday, the chief of naval operations, testifying to the Senate on May 25th of last year.
And so we refused to put an additional dollar against that system that wouldn't match the Chinese undersea threat.
As far as finances are concerned, the Navy estimated that retiring the Lemons, just cutting our losses now, would save a little under $1 billion a year, which they said they could better spend on missiles and ammunition. But then the private sector got involved. The companies that make money with that $1 billion that would be saved, repairing the littoral combat ships, well, they would lose that money if the Lemons were thrown in the trash where they belong. And so they used their money to hire lobbyists, who would use their personal connections in Congress to convince lawmakers to keep the fatally flawed ships, so that those companies could make money fixing the Lemons. BAE Systems, to be specific, wanted the $1.3 billion that they were promised to fix the Lemons in their shipyard in Jacksonville, Florida. And so businessmen hired to do the bidding of BAA Systems flew from Jacksonville to Washington, D.C. and had meetings with Republicans in Congress, including Senator Rick Scott, who used to be the governor of Florida, Representative Jack Bergman from the House Armed Services Committee, who was a former military commander and strategist, a top-tier member of the military, who was elected to Congress promising to cut spending. And phone calls were made by BAE lobbyists to Representative John Rutherford of Florida, whose district is home to the BAE shipyard in Jacksonville, Florida. John Rutherford sits on the House Appropriations Committee, the committee that decides where our money goes. The general manager of BAE Systems Jacksonville Shipyard described Representative John Rutherford in an interview as, quote, a great friend to the shipyard, unquote, and he said, quote, he carries the water for us, unquote, which he meant as a compliment. But the efforts of BAE Systems, which spent $3.7 million on lobbying in 2022, were successful because Section 1029 of the NDAA prohibits the military from retiring more than 4 of the littoral combat ships. So the military wanted to trash 8 of them. And so the lawmakers seem to have split the difference and forced them to keep 4. 4 ships that we know are lemons. 4 ships that we know can't take a hit from a well-made missile. 4 ships we know put our sailors in greater danger than they need to be. Also, some corporations can make money that they were promised to do unnecessary work. And so since the military was forced to keep these ships, they are clearly trying to think of other ways to get rid of these threats to the safety of our sailors. And here's one of those ideas. Here's Admiral Michael Gilday again on May 25th of last year.
In terms of what are the options going forward with these ships, I would offer to the subcommittee that we should consider offering these ships to other countries that would be able to use them effectively. There are countries in the southern in South America, as an example, as you pointed out, that would be able to use these ships that have small crews.
And look at this. Section 1029 also requires that before a littoral combat ship is retired or placed in storage, that it be evaluated for a potential transfer to a partner country. These ships endangered the lives of American sailors. And so let's give them to South Americans, whose lives are apparently worth less. And that's a pattern in our foreign policy. Having our policies physically enforced by foreigners whose lives are apparently considered worth less than Americans. This policy choice also makes it seem like we're not involved in these skirmishes when we actually are at the center of them. Which is why today I want to highlight the Foreign Military Financing Program. On November 3rd, 1961, President Kennedy signed the Foreign Assistance Act in order to facilitate transferring weapons to partners who were fighting on the market economy side of the Cold War, which, as you might recall, was a war against everything communist, as in communism, an economic system. That 1961 law placed the State Department in a central role in determining where anti-communist military assistance and training programs would take place. The weapons transfers were then further legalized with the Arms Export Control Act of 1976, which set the terms for when we can transfer weapons to other countries, which boiled down to permitting weapons transfers for a country's legitimate self-defense or to prevent the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. And again, the State Department was the prime decision center. But in the 1980s, using NDAAs like the one we're talking about today, Congress gave the Department of Defense more authorities to transfer weapons, many of those authorities being granted to fight the drug war in Central and South America. And then came 9/11. After 9/11, weapons transfer authorities were expanded way beyond what was allowed previously to allow weapons transfers for, quote, security cooperation, unquote, with partners in W's war on terror. And in 2006, Congress enacted the first global Department of Defense authority that allowed weapons to be transferred expressly for the purpose of training and equipping the national military forces of other countries. Here's Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut in the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations on March 10th of last year.
According to one study, the DoD manages 48 of the 50 new security assistance programs that were created after the 9/11 attacks. And out of the 107 existing security assistance programs today, DoD manages 87, a whopping 81% of those programs. That is a fundamental transition from the way in which we used to manage security assistance. And my worry is that it takes out of the equation the people who have the clearest and most important visibility on the ground as to the impact of that security assistance and those transfers.
So he's not too worried about the transfers themselves, but that the decisions for the weapons transfers is clearly shifting from the diplomacy department to the War Department. I can understand his concern, but can we just marinate on the number of these programs that exist for a second? 170 programs? That's a lot of weapons being paid for by us and passed out around the world. And we know that some of these programs are quite large, because this authority was used to build the militaries of Iraq and Afghanistan via the Iraq and Afghanistan Security Forces Fund. This authority was used to train God only knows who to fight the boogeymen we never seem to hear about anymore, the ISIL guys, and to train fighters during that regime change attempt that was launched in the Obama years in Syria, which, by the way, is still ongoing now that Obama's vice president, Joe Biden, has been promoted to president. And if you are at all concerned about the tens of thousands of people who are homeless in Syria because of the recent earthquakes, you should know that our country has been blocking their country from the World Trade System economy since at least 2015. And so if our country actually gave a hot damn about the Syrian people, we would let them have their president, even if he's an asshole and even if he wants to partner with Russia instead of the World Trade System countries. But in letting them have their president, whether we like the dude or not, we would lift the sanctions that prevent them from getting basic goods and services in their country, even in the best of times. This is especially necessary right now in the worst of times. And any offer of help from the Biden administration that doesn't lift sanctions can only be regarded as hollow. But jumping off my soapbox and back to foreign military financing, this authority is also being used right now to build militaries for countries near China via the Indo-Pacific Maritime Security Initiative. And this authority is being used and was increased dramatically in the last year under the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative. And so there's 2 points I want to make about this reality. First, our country creating militaries for other countries is a relatively new phenomenon. It wasn't like this before 2006, which wasn't that long ago. According to the Assistant Secretary of State Jessica Lewis, in written testimony that she submitted to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee last March, the Department of Defense, just the Defense Department, now has 25 different authorities that allow weapons transfers and sales to other countries, which could help explain how there are 170 different programs in effect right now. And 2, we are watching these authorities be used in real time to get us into an obvious proxy war with a nuclear power. My concern is that no one paid attention when the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative was created 9 years ago. And look at where we are now and where we seem to be headed. Because as should come as no surprise, this NDAA extends the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, which was first written into the 2016 NDAA. The authorities for the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative are valid until the end of not this year, but next year, 2024. And so we're going to be providing weapons and funding for Ukraine's war for at least the next 2 years, showing in law that those in power don't envision this war ending anytime soon. Not that anyone in the Biden administration seems to be trying to end it, because the longer it drags on, the closer they get to this goal. Here's former Raytheon board member and current Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin speaking to reporters in April of last year.
We want to see Russia weakened to the degree that it can't do the kinds of things that it has done in invading Ukraine.
And so in furtherance of that goal, this NDAA changes the prior authorizations to allow our money and weapons to flow not only to the Ukrainian government's forces, but also to, quote, other forces or groups recognized by and under the authority of the government of Ukraine, unquote, which sounds a lot like an authorization to fund private contractors to me. On top of that, a new authority is added, which is the authority for your tax money to be used to pay the salaries and expenses of fighters in Ukraine. And so we're going to pay for their soldiers as if they were our own. It also adds the authority to provide Ukraine with fighter jets. Until December, Ukraine was allowed to get surveillance drones. Now it's allowed to get manned and unmanned, quote, attack, strike, airlift, and surveillance aircraft, unquote. And so even though President Biden is saying to the American people that we are not going to gift fighter jets to Ukraine and further provoke Russia into maybe a nuclear war, Congress has already given the president the permission that he needs to do so. So just keep that in mind. And if the national debt is at all a concern to you, You should know that there's an entire section waiving cost control and transparency requirements for contracts for weapons for Ukraine, allowing the war profiteering companies to get contracts that guarantee 15% in profit, and the companies can exceed that profit margin if they manage to cut costs, or corners, as it may be, after being awarded the contract. And the contracts are allowed to be multi-year contracts for a long list of weapons, which is great for the weapons manufacturers and the shareholders who have bet on those companies' success. And that good fortune is by design. Here's Tina Kadenow, who was the acting assistant secretary of the Bureau of Political Military Affairs at the State Department during this 2017 hearing about foreign military sales process and policy.
Arms transfers support the U.S. defense industrial base, and they reduce the cost of procurement for our own U.S. military. Purchases made through the foreign military sales, known as the FMS system, often can be combined with our Defense Department orders to reduce unit costs. Beyond this, the U.S. defense industry directly employs over 1.7 million people across our nation.
War as an excellent business opportunity is something being acknowledged and celebrated by current Pentagon officials as well. Here's the commander of U.S. Southern Command, General Laura Richardson, answering a question posed to her in an interview at the Atlantic Council just last month.
But Russia can't have the ability to provide many of these countries with resupply or new weapons. I mean, they're struggling to supply themselves in many cases for Ukraine. So is that presenting an opportunity for maybe the U.S. to slide in?
It is, absolutely. And we're taking advantage of that, I'd like to say. So we are working with those countries that have the Russian equipment to either donate it or switch it out for United States equipment.
Are countries taking?
They are, yeah.
And so how did we get here? Funding a massive military jobs program in a country most of us couldn't find on a map in 2021. Actually, I bet most of us couldn't find it on a map now. Well, in Ukraine, it started with a partnership program. Here's the commander of U.S. Southern Command again, the South America Division of the military, General Laura Richardson. This was from just last month.
National Guard State Partnership Program is huge. We have the largest National Guard State Partnership Program. It has come up a couple times with Ukraine. Ukraine has the State Partnership Program with California. Mm-hmm. How did we initially start our great coordination with Ukraine? It was leveraged through the National Guard State Partnership Program that California had. But I have the largest out of any of the COCOMs. I have 24 state partnership programs. Utilize those to the nth degree in terms of another lever.
And sure enough, the National Guard Partnership Program was overfunded in this year's NDAA as well. In fact, Congress doubled the funding that the DoD requested. And so the Department of Defense requested $100 million. They got $200 million. And in a line item that I think is especially relevant to South America in General Richardson's area of responsibility, there was a massive overfunding of the National Guard counter-drug schools. The Department of Defense requested $5.8 million for those counter-drug schools and got $25.8 million, almost 5 times more than they wanted. And so if you zoom out, look at the big picture. Over the years, I've started to look for the seeds of partnerships, which can be found in the lists of countries eligible for foreign military financing. I saw the seeds in 2014 in a law no one paid attention to that provided millions to Ukraine after a low-key regime change was midwifed there in part by then Vice President Joe Biden. If that law hadn't landed on my desk, I never would have known that happened. It was all so under the radar. Until now, I didn't know about the National Guard partnership that started us on this path to the proxy war in Ukraine that we're in right now. It started all those years ago. I had no idea. But the foreign military financing and foreign military sales programs in Ukraine, those were out in the open for anyone who bothered to look. We could have seen it way back in 2014. In fact, we did. And so looking at the foreign military financing program in 2023, the NDAA provides over $6 billion for the foreign military financing program for countries all over the world. And in that section, a line jumped out at me, not because it's the largest amount of money or the most strategically important country, but because it's new. I spotted $5 million for Ecuador. And I wanted to know why Ecuador. I wanted to know why any new country is being added to the list. Because the seeds to the Ukraine situation, like I said, were planted in 2014, when we quietly started building Ukraine's new government, a military. We funded it, we trained it, but we didn't staff it. It's staffed with Ukrainians. That military that we built, trained, and paid for, but didn't staff, got attacked last year, and now we are still funding it and still training it, obviously. I mean, that's the one thing we all know to be fact, right? But that's what can happen long term when we choose to go down this path, planting seeds of militarism in other countries. We can end up in a proxy war with a nuclear power. And in this NDAA, I saw seeds planted in Ecuador. So Ecuador, if you're as unfamiliar with geography as I am, is a small country on the west coast of South America, just south of Colombia. I definitely had to look that up. But a good chunk of the country's east side is in the Amazon rainforest, home to some of the most incredible biodiversity on the planet, which means Ecuador is also blessed with natural resources. In 2017, Ecuador was considered to have the third largest proven reserves of oil in South America, with 8.3 billion barrels. And petroleum is Ecuador's largest export to the United States, which is the country's top trade partner. Ecuador also has minerals that the World Trade System companies would love to take and profit from. One such mineral is copper, which is especially enticing to car manufacturers that want to replace all of our fossil fuel guzzling cars with electric cars. And copper is needed for the electric car batteries. And so basically, Ecuador has resources that the multinationals want, which is why the World Trade System wants Ecuador's government to adhere to the rules of its corporate profit facilitation system. And in the 1990s, the World Trade System had made progress in integrating Ecuador into their system. For example, in 1994, the World Bank funded the Project for Mining Development and Environmental Control, which made recommendations for legal changes that were integrated into law in the year 2000, which deregulated the mining industry in Ecuador. But that progress stalled and, in many cases, reversed with the election of Rafael Correa as Ecuador's president in 2006. Rafael Correa is a U.S.-trained economist, and so he understood the World Trade System, but instead of joining it, he resisted it. And lots of Ecuadorians seemed to like him because he got elected president 3 times and served as president for a full decade, from 2007 to 2017. And during his time in office, he proved himself to be against the U.S. as world police and against the integration of his country into the World Trade System. His original sin was a doozy. Because in 2008, Correa allowed Ecuador to default on its debt despite Ecuador's ability to pay, calling the debt to foreign bankers that was racked up by the country's previous dictatorship, quote, immoral and illegitimate, unquote. By 2008, Ecuador had more than paid back all it had borrowed under the dictatorship, but was still being sent high bills made up of the accumulation of interest and banker fees. Many American students can relate to this feature in World Trade System banking. But in a move that shocked and pissed off the World Trade System devotees, Correa refused to pay a $31 million interest payment, even though he could pay it if he wanted to. That same year, in 2008, Correa reversed the corporate-friendly changes to the mining laws that the World Bank people got enacted in the year 2000, calling the country's mining activity a public utility and requiring all mining profits to be transferred to the Ecuadorian government. And also, in 2008, he banned foreign military bases, following up that ban with action in 2009 when he shut down U.S. counter-drug operations at the Manta Air Force Base. A couple of years later, in April 2011, he expelled the U.S. ambassador, Heather Hodges, after WikiLeaks disclosures showed that she was spreading rumors that President Correa was enabling corruption. And although a new ambassador was allowed to be appointed in 2012, that same year, Ecuador allowed WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange to live in their embassy in London. What a shameful blemish on the U.S. Constitution that we are still trying to throw that Australian journalist in prison for the not a crime of journalism more than a decade later. But back to President Correa. In mid-2013, Correa issued an executive decree that allowed his government to disband civil society organizations, which are organizations that State Department and USAID officials have a long history of funding to further their missions of meddling in the politics of other countries. The following year, in 2014, President Correa imposed restrictions on the work of USAID itself, insisting that USAID partner organizations be registered with the government, which resulted in USAID closing its offices in Ecuador after 60 years of operating in the country. And then that same year, 2014, Correa expelled the World Bank's representative from his country as well. And over those years, because Ecuador's access to global financial markets had been limited by its 2008 purposeful default on its debt to the multinational bankers, the Correa government turned to others who weren't faithful disciples of the World Trade System, specifically China, for its international banking needs. From 2005 to 2014, Chinese banks provided almost $11 billion of financing to Ecuador. But those loans didn't come without strings. The loans made by China to the Correa administration required that Ecuador pay China back the equivalent of roughly 3 years of the country's oil production, or 500 million barrels of oil, through 2024 in loans for oil arrangements. Basically, China locked down access to arguably the world's most valuable natural resource with those loans. But things started changing politically in Ecuador around the same time that things got real crazy here in the States with the election of a new president. Because in 2017, that was the first time in a decade that President Correa did not run for re-election. That year, Lenin Moreno became Ecuador's president. Moreno had campaigned on continuing the work of the Correa government, but in those campaigns, he suggested that Ecuador needed to find a better balance between public and private interests, which is like hearing politicians promise here in the States that they support public-private partnerships. That's a code. It's a dog whistle to the world traders saying, "I'm with you," in a way that only those in the know would spot. And sure enough, Lenin Moreno won the election and then got to work restarting the World Trade System integration. Very different policies from the previous administration. So in 2019, the Moreno administration finalized a $4.2 billion loan from the IMF that would support the Moreno government's economic policies over the next 3 years, conditioned, of course, on changes to Ecuador's economic laws. That same year, the Moreno administration allowed foreign investment into the energy sector, as in he allowed multinationals into Ecuador to profit from Ecuador's oil. Then in 2020, COVID. Everything changes with COVID. And so after getting hit hard on COVID Wave 1, Moreno imposed $4 billion in public spending cuts, which world traders tend to encourage, and he defaulted on some of the country's debt. But this time, the default was because Ecuador's government ran out of cash during a global health crisis, not because of any political resistance to the loan sharks. And so, in September of 2020, the World Trade System loan shark, the IMF, was welcomed again into Ecuador. The IMF issued Ecuador a $6.5 billion loan to deal with COVID, with strings attached that required more changes to their economic laws. In the next month, to please the IMF loan sharks, Moreno took away a fuel subsidy that had made oil and gas prices affordable for the Ecuadorian citizens for 40 years. But violent protests were the result, and that decision was reversed. But you get the point. Starting in 2017, the World Trade System was back in Ecuador. And then the World Trade System won Ecuador's 2021 presidential election when Ecuadorian citizens elected Guillermo Lasso. And the World Trade System loves this guy. Guillermo Lasso is a former CEO-level banker. Guillermo Lasso is a former head of operations in Ecuador for multinational sugar dealer Coca-Cola. Guillermo Lasso campaigned on, quote, increasing liberalization of the economy, unquote, which is code for integrating into the World Trade System. Guillermo Lasso campaigned on shrinking the government, because less government means less policing of multinational corporations and fewer taxes for those companies to pay. And economically, Guillermo Lasso campaigned on reducing overall corporate taxes. In fact, he wanted to exempt some companies in the energy industry from paying any taxes at all for 10 years. He also campaigned on doubling oil production, deregulating the mining industry again, and privatizing Ecuador's roads. Like, talk about a puppet. The hand of the World Trade System is shoved way up this guy's ass. I mean, Guillermo Lasso is so obviously on Team World Trade that he even invited Juan Guaido as president of Venezuela to his inauguration. And if you don't understand the significance of that, check out the Venezuela episodes from 2017. Juan Guaido. And since he became president 2 years ago, Guillermo Lasso has been working on locking his policies down and integrating Ecuador into the World Trade System using international trade agreements. And so in 2021, the first phase of a limited trade agreement with the United States entered into force because Ecuador is the only country on the Pacific coast of the Americas with no free trade agreement with the U.S. And then in January of 2022, Ecuador began the process of becoming a full member of the regional free trade bloc known as the Pacific Alliance, a free trade bloc founded in 2011 by Mexico, Colombia, Peru, and Chile, all World Trade System partners. But around the same time, Ecuador announced the start of negotiations for a free trade agreement with China, which this year surpassed the U.S. as Ecuador's top trading partner on things that are not oil, such as shrimp, bananas, flowers, and coffee. Ecuador is set to become the fourth country in Latin America to have a free trade agreement with China. And action was swift to this news in the U.S. Congress. On February 7th, 2022, the same exact day that the American press reported that Ecuador was working on a trade deal with China, shameless warmonger of the Democrat variety, Senator Bob Menendez of New Jersey, introduced the United States-Ecuador Partnership Act of 2022. Now, his bill never got voted on in either the Senate or the House, and yet significant portions of it are now law because it got attached to the NDAA. Ladies and gentlemen, we have ourselves a legislative dingleberry. Now, despite the undeniably rancid path to law that the United States-Ecuador Partnership Act of 2022 took, I do want to acknowledge that the law does some things that I at least consider positive, mainly via USAID. So, for example, our money will be used to partner with the government of Ecuador in support of reforestation and improving river, lake, and coastal water quality. And who doesn't want to preserve the Amazon rainforest? I mean, aside from corporate greed monsters, of course. But because of this law, we're also going to cooperate with Ecuador on emergency preparedness and disaster recovery, which is important in a place prone to large earthquakes, which is also home to some of the world's most dangerous volcanoes. And so I know that I focus on the infuriating in these bills and laws because there's so much of it and we can't change what we aren't aware of. But know that there are genuinely good things about this partnership and the law that created it. But there's more to be concerned about, at least if you think that it's right and proper for other countries to be free to govern themselves as they see fit. If you're someone who believes in actual democratic governance and don't just use the word democracy for propaganda purposes. And the U.S.-Ecuador Partnership Act of 22 is all about facilitating U.S. interference in the government of Ecuador. So first, the new dingleberry law says that USAID will provide research and analysis on, quote, budgetary and economic issues, unquote, pending before Ecuador's National Assembly. As in, USAID will be openly interfering in Ecuadorian politics by pressuring Ecuador's Congress on economic bills. And one specific strategy mentioned in the law was USAID facilitating meetings between members of our Congress and theirs. The law also says USAID will seek to, quote, improve democratic governance, unquote, through, quote, effective legislation, unquote, which sounds to me like our government pushing for new laws that change their electoral system. And what kind of changes we will be seeking, I don't know. The law also requires the Secretary of State to, quote, develop and implement a strategy, unquote, to create a digital customs system in Ecuador, basically to make business in Ecuador easier for multinational corporations. And one of the industries the State Department is specifically ordered to make things easier for is the mining industry, as the State Department is required to try to get mining laws changed. Now, it doesn't list specific goals for their efforts to, quote, strengthen the regulatory framework, unquote, but I have my assumptions. And I'm going to keep those assumptions to myself because they are assumptions. But yes, I'm thinking exactly what you think I'm thinking about the probable goals of new mining laws. And in a provision that will surely help the Bechtels of the world, the law requires the State Department to redesign Ecuador's infrastructure project contracts bidding process so that it complies with, quote, global standards and norms, unquote, which looks like another code for World Trade System rules for me. You know, the people that are devoted to the World Trade System, they love to refer to it as the rules-based international order, as if their rules are the only rules possible, the only standards and norms that could exist, and that any other system wouldn't be based on rules. And so when I see something like this, when I see that the State Department will be helping Ecuador's government to redesign its infrastructure project contracting process to make it comply with global standards and norms, for me, that means their standards. That means World Trade standards. Because they are clearly worried about how many infrastructure projects are being funded outside the World Trade System in South America. They're clearly concerned about how many projects are being funded by China's Belt and Road Initiative. Here's General Laura Richardson, the commander of Southcom, again last month at the Atlantic Council.
The Belt and Road Initiative that has been ongoing for the last over a decade in this region. 21 of 31 countries that have signed on to this Belt and Road Initiative. I could take Argentina last January, the most recent signatory onto the Belt and Road Initiative, and $23 billion in infrastructure projects, that signatory and signing on to that. But again, 21 of 31 countries. There are 25 countries that actually have infrastructure projects by the PRC. 4 that aren't signatories of the BRI, but that do actually have projects within their countries. But not just that, deep water ports in 17 countries. I mean, this is critical infrastructure that's being invested in. I have the most space-enabling infrastructure in the Western Hemisphere, in Latin America and the Caribbean. And I just cause question, why? Why is all of this critical infrastructure being invested in so heavily? In terms of telecommunications, 5G, I've got 5 countries with the 5G backbone in this region. I've got 24 countries with the PRC Huawei 3G, 4G. 5 countries have the Huawei backbone infrastructure. If I had to guess, they'll probably be offered a discount to upgrade and stay within the same PRC network. And so very, very concerning as we work with our countries.
And look at that. The new law also requires the State Department to try to stop Ecuador from contracting with companies from governments, quote, without reliable legal checks, unquote, China, for their communications networks. Because you just heard the Southcom commander. DoD is worried about Chinese telecommunication networks. And I don't have any sound clips handy, but over the years, I've noticed that many in our Congress are super paranoid about Huawei, which is like the Chinese Apple. I saw their stores all over Portugal and Poland last year. But they are afraid that if Chinese companies are able to operate telecommunications networks internationally, that those companies will allow the Chinese government to use those networks to spy on the world. Which, projection much? Because that's exactly what our country did with the multinational corporate telecommunications networks in the highly classified PRISM program. And for those that don't remember, you know all those classified lines that I took hours to sift through and add up in the defense funding? Well, for years, one of the programs being paid for with classified funding was PRISM, the National Security Agency's partnership with Microsoft, Yahoo, Google, Facebook, AOL, Skype, YouTube, Apple, AT&T, Verizon, Sprint, and others, all of whom which were essentially allowing the government to tap their wires and collect information on the whole world without our knowledge or consent. And seeing as how China is using the World Trade System playbook to get countries around the world indebted to them, well, the world traders are afraid that China is looking at the spying page in that playbook, a page that was released to the world by Edward Snowden. And so overall, what I'm seeing in the NDAA is that the State Department is basically directed to keep companies from the non-World Trade System countries out of Ecuador as much as possible and get World Trade System multinational corporations in, and to get organizations paid for with U.S. tax money to finance these privatized projects. Because the law says specifically that the State Department needs to, quote, find roles, unquote, in Ecuador for the United States International Development Finance Corporation and the Millennium Challenge Corporation. And to make all of those new contracts for the multinational stick, the new law also directs the State Department to, I'm going to say, interfere in Ecuador's justice system. Because it tells the State Department to, quote, increase the capacity, unquote, of their Justice Department and to, quote, assist, unquote, judges and prosecutors to enforce laws. But I don't know what increase the capacity or assist mean in practice, like in reality. The only thing I'm sure of is that both of those terms clearly imply some kind of interference in Ecuador's judicial system. And a lot of the sections of law that the State Department will seek to have enforced are corporate laws, as our new law now directs the State Department to seek Ecuadorian prosecutorial crackdowns on illegal mining, illegal logging, and illegal fishing. But here's the part of our new law that made me, care. Our new dingleberry law also requires the State Department to support Ecuador's national police and armed services. Some items specifically listed for transfer to the police and soldiers of Ecuador include radars, boats, and communications equipment. On top of that, though, Ecuador, in this NDAA, becomes eligible for foreign military financing, military education, and training programs. And just like that, a seed is planted. And the reason for this, again, is China fear. Fear of the competition that China's economic contracts pose to the world trade system, and the power that China acquires with every new contract and trade agreement, like the trade agreement that was announced between Ecuador and China the day that this dingleberried law was born. And it's not just economic power that's feared with every new contract, every new infrastructure project that is funded and often controlled by Chinese companies. Here's General Laura Richardson, the Southcom commander, being interviewed last month.
You know, you got to question, why are they investing so heavily everywhere else across the planet? And I worry about these dual-use state-owned enterprises that pop up from the PRC. And I worry about the dual-use capability, being able to flip them around and use them for military use.
And so, Team World Trade intends to integrate with Ecuador's military before the Chinese can. And the current Ecuadorian president is totally on board. In fact, for at least the last year and a half, Guillermo Lasso has been pushing for a Plan Ecuador. That's what he calls it. The goal of which would be to use U.S., Colombian, and European Union money to build up the Ecuadorian government's armed forces and national police. That name, Plan Ecuador, is a direct reference to what has been going on in their next-door neighbor country for decades, Plan Colombia. And that name, Plan Colombia, might sound familiar because it's a partnership that's been quite literally poisonous. I know that I was well aware of it because of the scandals involved in it for many years. Plan Colombia is a partnership that was formed with Colombia by the Clinton administration. A partnership that was never actually authorized by Congress, but was funded by Congress many times, adding up to billions of dollars, at least $12 billion. A main goal of Plan Colombia has been to destroy the drug-related economy of Colombia by literally poisoning its coca fields. But of course, when we spray glyphosate, a poison acknowledged by the World Health Organization to cause cancer, from airplanes onto coca fields, more than just coca plants get poisoned. It poisons food crops, wildlife, and people. And also as part of Plan Colombia, we also funded and trained Colombian military and police who would physically fight the Colombians who were growing, processing, and transporting cocaine. Plan Colombia was a foreign military financing program. We funded and trained Colombians because Congress had prohibited U.S. forces from participating in combat missions in Colombia directly. And this program has gone on for so long that our students have now become the teachers. Here's General Laura Richardson, the Southcom commander, testifying to Congress last year.
Colombia, for example, our strongest partner in the region, exports security by training other Latin American militaries to counter transnational threats.
The United States Colombia Action Plan for Regional Security was created by the Obama-Biden administration in 2012 because they apparently considered Plan Colombia to be a smashing success, despite all the poisoning, murdering, and suffering. And so the Obama-Biden administration decided to make their Colombian students in war the new teachers. Using our tax money provided under this program from 2013 to 2017, Colombia trained almost 17,000 people to fight using locations in Panama, Costa Rica, El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, and the Dominican Republic. The people trained came from countries all over the globe, but according to the Congressional Research Service, about 80% of the people trained were from Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean. To anyone watching these training exercises, they would never know that the United States had anything to do with it. They would see Colombians training Central Americans in Central America. It's a brilliant strategy to hide U.S. involvement in militarizing the world. And this NDAA expands that program by allowing the Defense Department to pay for training, supplies, travel, subsistence, personal expenses, and whatever, quote, special compensation, unquote, is for those that participate in the training program conducted by Colombia under the United States Colombia Action Plan for Regional Security. The authorization that I saw doesn't set a dollar amount limit on this outsourced soldier training program, but I think I found how much it's getting this year in the funding law. So overall, the 2023 funding law provides over $487 million for Colombia, almost $500 million, which is the highest funding level in the last decade. $38.5 million of that is for foreign military financing, and over $1.8 million is for international military education, which sounds like Colombian training, maybe? I'm not sure. But even if these were hard numbers with transfer authorities, which allows money to be shifted between accounts quite easily, who really knows the funding level? The main point is that Plan Colombia, that partnership, it's been going on for decades, and it's continuing. And it's already cost us billions. And so when the next door neighbor, President Guillermo Lasso, pushes for a Plan Ecuador to build up the Ecuadorian armed forces and national police, and then the 2023 NDAA tells the State Department to build up the Ecuadorian armed forces and national police, well, it sure looks like Plan Ecuador got the green light to me. And to get public support, or distract the public from noticing, the interference of this foreign nation of ours in their government, the State Department is required to, quote, support the efforts of civil society organizations and independent media to conduct oversight of Ecuador's government, unquote. And this feels like a good time to remind you that the Global Engagement Center is a thing I nicknamed the Ministry of Propaganda when it was created in the 2017 NDAA. Here's Brian Nichols. He's the Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs at the U.S. Department of State, testifying to Congress at the end of 2021.
The Global Engagement Center both measures public opinion and social media trends throughout the world. They actively work to counter false messages from our strategic competitors, and they prepare media products or talking points that our embassies and consulates around the hemisphere can use to combat disinformation.
According to its founding document, the NDAA for 2017, the Global Engagement Center exists to track stories abroad that threaten the interests of the United States and U.S. allies and partner nations, aka threaten the World Trade System. And then it exists to promote what they call, quote, fact-based narratives, unquote, to audiences outside the United States, which in practice looks something like this. Here's Peter Natello. He is the Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator for the Latin America and Caribbean Bureau at the U.S. Agency for International Development. Here he is testifying to Congress in March of 2022.
One example that I could provide is work that we've done in Ecuador with Ecuadorian journalists to investigate, to analyze, and to report on the issue of illegal and unregulated fishing off Ecuador's coast. And we do that because we want to ensure that Ecuadorian citizens have fact-based information upon which they can make decisions about China and countries like China and whether they want their country working with them.
Do you think those fact-based narratives about China are positive or negative? But anyway, while we are on the subject, sort of fishing off the Ecuadorian coast, the final thing I want to tell you about in the NDAA's new authorizations for Ecuador are the ships that we're going to gift to that tiny nation. Because the NDAA authorizes 2 ships to be given to Ecuador as, quote, excess defense articles, unquote. And I looked up how much each of these ships are worth, and it's about $65 million per ship. And the only reason I care that much about that is that there's a limit that Congress put into law on how much we can give away in excess defense articles. The limit is $500 million per year. But these ships aren't going to count against that limit. They just exempted these ships from showing up in the budget. So much for fiscal responsibility. But the most fascinating thing to me about this part of the NDAA is that Ecuador will be required to repair the 2 ships at a shipyard inside the United States. And that's a lot of unnecessary and expensive travel required to fix problems with those 2 boats. And this is the situation that Congress saddled Ecuador with when they included that string. And clearly they knew it. So here's Representative Jackie Speer of California on the floor of the House of Representatives on June 15th of last year. During a debate about those littoral combat ships that the military wanted to trash, but Congress is forcing them to keep.
One major reason for the excessive costs of LCS contractors. Unlike other ships where sailors do the maintenance, LCS relies almost exclusively on contractors who own and control the technical data needed to maintain and repair.
And so by not allowing Ecuadorian sailors to fix these boats in Ecuador themselves, by requiring Ecuador to hire American contractors in America to fix the boats, we're setting up Ecuador's taxpayers for similar excessive costs. But that's not a problem if that's the goal. Here's General Laura Richardson, the Southcom commander again. This is from last month at the Atlantic Council.
And, as I work with our partner nations and they invest in U.S. equipment, which is the best equipment, I must say, I am a little biased, but it is the best equipment. And they also buy into the supply chain of spare parts and all those kinds of things that help to sustain this piece of equipment over many, many years.
Which means that the companies that make those spare parts and sustain the equipment on the boats will profit for many, many years. A gift with strings like that attached is not a gift. That's a deal designed to waste Ecuadorian government money in a way that transfers their tax money into World Trade System multinational corporate profit. World Trade System, transforming government money into corporate profits. It's actually a perfect slogan for their system, although entirely too honest. And so, with that seems like enough World Trade System shenanigans for today. But although I'm done with this episode, I'm not yet done with the NDAA. There are a few more sections that I want to check out, so I'm going to be looking specifically at the sections about Taiwan and chemicals. These were long, and I really want to read them in detail. And I don't know if I'm going to produce episodes about either, but those are the other sections that I think I need to at least check out. And if there's stuff you need to know, I'll let you know. But I'm also going to be traveling over the next couple of weeks, and so I'm going to be binging hearings, as I always do, and I'll share the good stuff from those hearings with you too. But I just want to make you aware that for the next month or so, I'm going to be taking a little time away from at least producing Congressional Dish. I mean, I'm addicted to hearings. I'll never stop listening to those. But I haven't taken any time away from making episodes since last summer. And so what that means for you, as I do need this break, is that I might not be back with another public episode until the end of March. However, I will still be around on Patreon. And so if you support the show at any amount that you consider fair per episode, you can get updates about what's going on with me, the stuff we're working on, some bonus episodes. And so please support the show, and you're welcome to access what I have in Patreon and what I have nicknamed my green room, because actually, if you pay for ways other than Patreon, we do have ways to get you access to that feed. So pay us and email lauren@congressionaldish.com and we'll get you set up with the green room feed if you don't like Patreon for whatever reason. But my green room is the place where I let loose and seek advice on the direction of this show from my co-producers, co-workers, my friends, my people. And I'd love for you to be one of my people. And all you have to do, because I'm kind of a whore like this, I guess, is pay me. And if you want to remain a cheap ass and not pay for this show, despite the fact that you know you're not finding this information anywhere else, well, if that's how you want to be, then I'll talk to you when I'm done with the next public episode, whenever that may be. We have no executive producers to announce this week, and so thank you to all producers who have made this episode possible and who helped me afford the amazing team that I can't imagine my future in podcasting without. So Claire, Mike, Brian, Lauren, Mark, Daryl, Emma, you guys are the best. And so until next time, thanks for listening and have a great day.
We're surrounded now by liars coming at us through our TV screens.
We don't have a domestic spying program.
They're content to fight in black and white despite the many in-betweens. We got a president who plays with the facts. And then he waves a flag to cover his tracks. As if a lie is alright, if the end will justify the means. Now we are so damn tired of being lied to.
The polar ice caps aren't going away.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies.
Government jobs consume the profits of the private sector.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. Now we're not keeping quiet.
These bills represent common sense, bipartisan solutions that actually solve problems.